Greetings, my name is Dr. Kamau Rashid. The title of this presentation is On the Limits of Reform, the Historical and Cultural Imperative for Independent African-Centered Education. I begin this presentation with a quote from Dr. Maulana Karenga, who writes, "The key crisis and challenge in black life is the cultural crisis and challenge." Culture is the primary determinant of social reality. Culture is defined as the totality of a people's worldviews, values, practices, and ideas. It shapes nearly every facet of how one engages the world. Thus, culture determines the economic, political, and social reality of any people. Any analysis that substantively engages culture is an analysis that should not nor cannot be rooted in presentism. It must therefore account fully for the historical dimension of phenomena. Thus, for instance, if we are alarmed at the failure of African children within the public schools of the United States, then we must understand that this present phenomenon is inextricably linked to the historical assault upon the minds and bodies of African people. This analysis contends that the intergenerational struggles of African people for self-determination are inextricably bound to the historical attack upon African culture, sovereignty, and humanity. Furthermore, any transformative effort must also seek to reorder the cultural orientation of the community as a means to achieve social, political, and economic transformation. This presentation represents an attempt to address socialization within the context of its capacity to either inform or constrain our capacity to achieve liberation. Specifically, I attempt to situate the imperatives of African liberation alongside the imperatives of African institution building within a historical and cultural framework. In his classic work, The Miseducation of the Negro, Dr. Carter G. Woodson decries the failure of Africans in America to create a model of education that is designed to address the fundamental problems of our reality. In the absence of creating an educational system that is for, by, and about the interests of our people, we have instead been given a miseducation system that purports to represent the interests of our people, while at the same time subverting the development of the type of critical consciousness needed in order to promote our agency and enable us to transform our reality. In characterizing this system, Woodson writes, "The education of the Negro must be carefully directed, lest the race may waste time trying to do the impossible. Lead the Negro to believe this, and thus control his thinking. If you can thereby determine what he will think, you will not need to worry about what he will do. You will not have to tell him to go to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, he will have one cut for his special benefit. His education makes this necessary." By doing the impossible, Woodson refers to the work of transforming and enabling the African community to be self-determining. He refers to this work as such because it is the process of miseducation that renders the idea of freedom as unthinkable. Moreover, Woodson contends that the effective subjugation of the mind renders the captivity of the body obsolete. He argues that once this process has been established and transmitted over the course of generations, miseducation reproduces what he refers to as the regime of the oppressor in the minds of the oppressed, thereby making the oppressed the agents of their own subjugation. Woodson's formulation recognizes the essential role that formal education plays in the socialization process. Socialization, however, cannot be disengaged from its cultural moorings. Again, it is culture that determines how reality is interpreted and engaged. Dr. Carruthers notes that miseducation is at its core a deliberate and systematic effort to annihilate the cultural and historical consciousness of our people, and to leave in its place an enfeebled acquiescence to an oppressive and alienated social order. Where it has succeeded, miseducation has created a maladaptive response on the parts of African people to their condition. It is posited in place of a functional sense of identity, purpose, and direction, a falsified consciousness that accepts the inherent legitimacy of the existing social order. In order to understand this system, we have to, again, go back in time and understand the era of enslavement. The introduction of the chattel slavery system in the Western Hemisphere necessitated a unique means of resocialization for African captives. This resocialization process was designed to subvert the natural human inclination or drive towards freedom, power, and ultimately sovereignty in all its myriad forms, that is, cultural, political, economic, and so on. Thus, in order to obliterate the humanity of the captive African, a process of resocialization was born. This process was designed, above all else, to impose upon the consciousness of the enslaved African what Dr. Maulana Karenga refers to as a catechism of impossibilities, whereby liberation is not only impossible but also unthinkable. It is here that we begin to see the beginnings of this process of miseducation in the Western Hemisphere, which has so plagued the African world. Part of what this process endeavored to do is to sever the linkages between the African human being and their ancestral culture, because it is within that chain that which connects one to one's past, which connects one to one's homeland, which connects one to one's understanding of tradition, which connects one to a grand conception of the future, whereby identity is anchored. Identity in the African worldview is not anchored in the sense of how I am and who I am as an individual, but is anchored to who I am as an extension of my people, right? My ancestors and those who come from my people, who represent my people, which will exist in the future. And so in order to transform the consciousness of African people, to obliterate that sense of connection, this sense of grounding and who one is, and the way that is reinforced by one's conscious understanding and practice of one's tradition, it was necessary to create a resocialization process, which was essentially an attack on African culture. It is the attack upon African culture, and with it African social agency, that is at its core what Dr. Maulana Karenga refers to as the key crisis and challenge in Black life. This means that no social transformation can be achieved without an antecedent cultural transformation. It is this cultural transformation that not only informs the nature of the struggle, but also informs both the material and spiritual goals that it seeks to achieve. Now, before advancing further, I want to revisit this definition of culture. I want to draw from the insight, the wisdom of Nana Ajay Akoto, who writes, "Culture is that totality of values, beliefs, and actions that characterize a people. Culture consists of the behavioral patterns, symbols, institutions, and values of a society, and is unique to that society. It is the spiritual, ideational, and material composite that distinguishes one society from another. It shapes and is in turn shaped by events in the realm of the spiritual, ideational, and the material. All inquiry and solution, truth and beauty, tradition and purity, meaning and reality are culturally relative. There are no culture-free or values-free human endeavors. Culture is not a static phenomenon. Culture continually evolves as the society evolves and develops. Culture is that composite of socially and historically determined behaviors that nourishes and thereby defines the intellectual and spiritual parameters within which the human individual develops and exists." Now, in this framework, culture is seen as the overarching construct within which ideology and institutions operate. In fact, both social ideology and institutions are mere extensions of culture. We can think of ideology as a system of ideas. We can think of institutions as organized systems of social behavior. Furthermore, it is the ideological rationalizations and institutional arrangements that supports, sustains, and defends oppression. In its ideological form, oppression asserts that the existing social order is implicitly rational and legitimate. It posits that society's organization is both natural and immutable, thereby interweaving ideology within the social fabric of everyday life. Therefore, ideology can be characterized as a deliberate, though subtle expression of power. It seeks, as Dr. Amos Wilson notes, to mask its role in manipulating social consciousness, thereby ensuring that the power of the dominant group, the power of Europeans, remains unchallenged. In addition to its ideological aspect, oppression is also institutional, in that it is sustained by a coherent system of social structures. These structures, though serving the interests of Europeans, are sufficiently flexible so as to both embrace and circumvent attempts at redirection by the masses. This means that for all the efforts that African people have made to attempt to reform dominant institutions, our capacity to do so is very limited, because those institutions are operating from the imperative of European domination and control. Their capacity to absorb demands for reform, to resist demands for reform by African people is sufficient, whereby they can absorb some of those demands, yet still maintain their insistence upon the subjugation of African people. Thus, reform as a strategy for achieving self-determination is exceedingly limited, because at no point do African people control the economic, political, or conceptual basis of any of the institutions which we are endeavoring to transform. So given everything that has been argued here, what is then the solution? Most obviously, it is the construction of an alternative and independent infrastructure designed to escape the debilitating de-education, that means the enfeebling of the mind, and the destructive miseducation of the U.S. public school system and all European school systems whereby African people's minds are ensnared. This alternative framework is imperative in order to construct a truly liberated African community. Now, returning briefly to the era of enslavement, one should note that as with all forms of bondage, slavery too demanded a plethora of resistance strategies on the part of African captives. These strategies ranged from different forms of nonviolent resistance, such as work slowdowns, sabotage, escapes, poisonings, arson, theft, and so on, to violent resistance, as in the case of Maroonage, and as well as insurrection, such as in the case of Denmark Vesey and so on. What is most important here is that the most successful models of African resistance to enslavement can be characterized by the following two features. First, a disengagement from the cultural logic of the oppressor, a cultural logic that equates the acceptance of servitude with sanity and or normality. And two, an accompanying re-engagement with the cultural logic and or the survival paradigm of African culture. This means that in each of these instances, whether maroonage or insurrection, there was a fundamental recognition of the inability of African sovereignty and European domination to coexist within the same spatial context. Thus, in their desire to seize and ensure their liberation, Africans were compelled to create a set of spatial, political, and economic arrangements independent from their oppressors. This particular strategy cannot be underemphasized in its conceptualization of freedom and self-determination as being both conceptual, that is, derived from and defined by a collection of theoretical and cultural paradigms, and also spatial, that is, represented by a collection of structural arrangements, as in the case of sovereign communities, institutions, and so on. It is the relevance and applicability of this model within the context of African-centered education to which we now turn. The Council of Independent Black Institutions, which was an umbrella organization that was created several decades ago for the independent African-centered schools movement, argued that, or defined African-centered education as follows: the means by which African culture, including the knowledge, attitudes, values, and skills needed to maintain and perpetuate it throughout the nation-building process, is developed and advanced through practice. Its aim, therefore, is to build commitment and competency within the present and future generations to support the struggle for liberation and nationhood. In short, the intent of African-centered education is to place the issues, problems, and priorities of African people at the center of the curriculum, with the ultimate goal of creating cadres of workers committed to liberation, committed to social transformation. Moreover, African-centered education draws from the deep well of African culture and history and attempts to use African culture and history to define our notions of progress, success, and victory. African-centered education is concerned, of course, with the ability to read, write, add, and subtract. However, it is most concerned with the ability of Africans to conceptualize and secure freedom and to define reality from our own image and interest in a manner that reclaims and reconstructs the rich and ancient culture of our people. Moreover, while it insists on the right of people of African descent to be self-determining, it also respects the rights of others to be self-determination and accepts the basic truth that the United States has sought to annihilate for the past several centuries, the multiple cultural realities that have always and continue to exist in this particular landmass. Moreover, African-centered education operates from the basic premise that the Ma'afa, that is, the tragedy of enslavement, colonialism, and the ongoing consequences and maintenance or adaptations of those processes have been the defining historical moment for Africans in the Americas. The deculturalization of African people and the historical legacy of enslavement has produced massive cultural misorientation. Because of the centuries-long psychological deterioration that this process has produced, there could be no viable solution that fails to reconstruct the historical and cultural consciousness of African people. This restoration and reconstruction, or re-Africanization process, is equally, if not more important than the transformation of the political and economic reality. In fact, as Dr. Maulana Karenga argues, the transformation of that consciousness is in fact the means which enables one to transform that reality. In addition, the necessity for independent educational institutions is based on three fundamental concerns. Number one, the historical role of the U.S. public schools in the miseducation of African people. Number two, the historical inability of public schools to serve as liberated zones, thereby staving off the interests of white supremacy indefinitely. And then number three, the reconstructive imperatives of African-centered education and the inability of the state to serve as an infrastructural apparatus for cultural revolution. And so when we engage in African-centered education, we develop several capacities. One, it places the community, when we create independent, specifically when we create independent institutions, places the community in charge of its own transformation as well as the education of its own children and families. In so doing, we restore the agency of our people. Number two, independent institutions are not dependent upon state funding and are only partially impacted by state policies. Number three, independent institutions are uninhibited in their capacity to facilitate the social transformation of the community. They may freely operate under whatever cultural, religious, political, and/or ideological orientation they choose. Finally, Independent educational institutions can assume a myriad of forms, from independent community schools to home schools, after-school programs to Saturday schools, rites of passage programs to various types of cultural institutes. Independent schools allow for a community of, or independent institutions allow for a community of committed individuals and families to come together for the sake of resocializing their children and resocializing the children of others. Additionally, community-based institutions can serve as hubs of cultural, political, and economic development in the communities in which they are situated. What each of these forms allow is for the members of the community to choose the model of education that best suits their needs. Some communities may focus on agriculture. Some communities, or at different points, people may focus on healing practices. Other communities may focus on language as a type of cultural transformation, the transformation of one's mind. Some communities may focus on a myriad of other types of activities. While each of these forms of schooling offer their own advantage, they allow for members of the community and families to control the educational process, and is an attempt to restore to resituate the locus of educational control within the hands of African people. I would say more, but time is against me. So I'll close by saying this. We have seen for the last several centuries that education is one of the key weapons in the control of African people, the control of our minds. And if we are serious about freeing ourselves, that is, transforming our minds, we have to recognize that an African-centered education is the most successful, the most certain means by which we can do so. But we also have to recognize that such a process can gain expression through myriad institutional forms. And with that, I'll close, and Asante Sana.